Our assembly this evening is co-sponsored by the School of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America. It thus befalls me as dean of that school to welcome to this campus and to this building anyone here who counts himself a visitor. We're very glad to have you with us. It also falls to me to give credit where it is due, since I cannot realistically hope to claim it all for myself. Although the School of Philosophy is the co-sponsor for this event, the institution that is really responsible for its coming to be is the Hildebrand Project. The Hildebrand Project has its origin in turn in one John Henry Crosby, the project's president and founder. John Henry is described on the website of the Hildebrand Project, a place I commend to you, as cultural entrepreneur, among other things. And this seems to me entirely apt. Had he not developed an interest some 15 years ago in the writings of the German philosopher and Catholic theologian Dietrich von Hildebrand, John Henry would doubtless now be the head of some billion-dollar startup manufacturing digital widgets in some offshore cloud. Instead, he has spent himself tirelessly in the dissemination of Hildebrand's writings as editor, translator, and publisher, but also as lecturer, writer, and conference organizer. Even if you've not read a word yet of von Hildebrand, may you soon make amends, you can be grateful to him for sparing us still more Silicon Valley flim-flam. Be that as it may, we are certainly all indebted to John Henry Crosby for having served as prime mover of our gathering here, under the intriguing, yet also maybe vaguely disturbing title, Beauty in a World of Ugliness. I mean, speaking truthfully, I don't see much ugliness looking out upon you, and if I did, I wouldn't say so. Since John Henry is also the moderator of our proceedings, I now gladly entrust your care to him. Thank you.
Well, given the Hildebrand Project's fundraising needs, I feel like I missed my vocation in Silicon Valley, and maybe I'll have to reevaluate the next chapter. Also, the credit is by no means, by the way, can I be heard? Okay. The credit by no means goes all to me. There are many other prime movers in the Hildebrand Project. There is, above all, Alice von Hildebrand, the widow of Dietrich von Hildebrand, who at the age of 95 remains sharp and very active in our work, in our vision. There is my father, Dr. John Crosby, who was himself a student of Dietrich von Hildebrand. There are my colleagues in the Hildebrand Project. There are benefactors. So maybe I can take the responsibility for a very small first step, but it's been accompanied all along by many others. I also want to thank you, John, for agreeing to co-host this event. This is our first formal collaboration with Catholic University's School of Philosophy, and I hope that I'd like to say that a turnout like this bodes well for further collaborations in the future, and we have many good things to come. So before turning to our main event, and I know why you're all really here, and it's because of our esteemed friend, Sir Roger Scruton, I just want to say a little bit about Dietrich von Hildebrand and the Hildebrand Project so that you all understand why we are hosting this event in the first place. So the occasion for this afternoon's event is the arrival, long awaited, of a major work of philosophical aesthetics. And this work, known simply as Aesthetics, is a 2-volume work by the philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand, written quite amazingly at the age of 80 in a period of 11 months. He said to his wife, "It's time I write my Aesthetics," and he delivered. 11 months, 30 pages a day, apparently he could write sometimes. And this was a lifetime of reflection on beauty, on aesthetic considerations that came pouring out of him. And it is the occasion of this event because this work is finally seeing the light of day. The first volume is recently out. Volume 2 is forthcoming in November, and we're very honored to have a wonderful foreword to that volume by Sir Roger. A word just on von Hildebrand. He was born 1889, raised in Florence in his father's home. His father was a renowned German architect in sculpture. Von Hildebrand was born really under the aegis of music. The day he was born, the composer Richard Strauss was knocking at the door looking for a recommendation from Adolf von Hildebrand. Von Hildebrand discovered philosophy as a teenager reading Platonic dialogues and went on to study with many of the leading minds in Germany. He studied under Edmund Husserl, the father of phenomenology. He studied under Max Scheler, who was a great friend of his, who is the source of his personalism. He studied under Adolf Reinach, who was also the great teacher of St. Edith Stein. He converted to Catholicism as a young man, primarily through the way of beauty, which gives you a sense already of his destiny to write about it. In beauty, beauty in art, beauty in nature, but in a special way, the beauty of the saints. It was the beauty of sanctity as he experienced it that finally opened the door into the church. In the early 1920s, he emerged as one of the first Catholics of stature to oppose the Nazis. Those of you who know your history, and in a room like this, I know many of you do, he was already blacklisted for assassination in 1923, the first time Hitler sought to seize power. He went then to Vienna, where he established the home base of the early Nazi resistance of Catholics and other like-minded people, founded a journal of intellectual resistance. When Hitler invaded Austria in 1938, von Hildebrand was a refugee for many years, had an extraordinary escape and a very moving escape, thanks to all those who helped him, and he arrived on our shores in 1940. He went on then to teach at Fordham University for 20 years. And during both his period in the States and in Europe, he was a prolific writer. In the 1920s, he inaugurated the whole personalist approach to marriage in books like In Defense of Purity. And then in his time in the States, he developed many of his ethical works. I'm sure all of you in this room have at least heard of a work such as Transformation in Christ, which is perhaps his most famous work. He was, of course, a prolific writer in the post-conciliar period, and many of those works now have a new resonance today. When he died in 1977, he left an extraordinary impact on the life of the church, and that impact, that tremendous legacy that he left behind remains to be unpacked. The fact that many of his works were written in German is what originally called the Hildebrand Project into existence. We were founded to translate and publish all of these works that he wrote in his late years in German. But the project is not just a vehicle for von Hildebrand's work. That's a primary object of our work. But we seek also to advance the whole tradition of personalism and Christian philosophy that he represents, and even beyond that, to bring his thought to bear on the immediate problems of culture. So this is not just an ivory tower project, it's also an in the trenches project as well. So it's in this framework of today's event that it's in this framework that we are having this gathering. It is the promotion of Dietrich von Hildebrand's legacy. It's the arrival of the aesthetics. And during this period to come, in the years to come, we will devote considerable time and energy to fostering discussion around the aesthetics of von Hildebrand, but perhaps even more fundamentally around the renewal of the idea of beauty, both as a credible concept, because I can tell you in many graduate programs it's a non-starter even to speak of beauty as a meaningful idea, but also as an ideal for creative work, for artists today, who many still will not identify themselves in terms of the creation of beautiful things. So Roger Scruton is one of today's most eminent champions of beauty, and I think that's one of the reasons so many of you are attracted to his work. And so we're delighted to be collaborating with him, to continue our collaboration with him. His thought on beauty has many rich points of contact with that of von Hildebrand, so we're very eager to foster that conversation. So just a word on format. It's very simple. We'll hear first from Sir Roger, then we'll have a response from David Schindler, then we'll have a response from Dr. Crosby, and from there we'll go straight to your questions, and we'll have as many questions as we can accommodate. There will be a wireless mic. I'd ask you all to use it, and I will moderate that discussion. And so without further ado, Sir Roger.
Thank you very much, John, for that introduction. And of course, the work of von Hildebrand, as you rightly say, is of particular relevance not only to the philosophy of beauty, but also to the Catholic tradition and the revival of Catholic intellectual life that has taken place recently, largely thanks to Pope John Paul II, who was himself a member of this personalist tradition in philosophy that you referred to, which grew in Central Europe in the first half of the 20th century, and the influence of which has not yet been sufficiently felt, I think, in this part of the world, or in general in the English-speaking world. And I suppose I would count myself as a kind of personalist, in that I think that the concept of the human person is fundamental to our understanding of the world as a whole, and indeed that the idea of beauty has its roots in that of personality. Today I'm just going to introduce the discussion with a few remarks about what ugliness is, and the way in which ugliness has come into our world as a kind of inevitable force, a force that seems to squeeze itself into every opening that is available to it. This is an unusual thing. It's not natural for human beings to pursue ugliness, to cultivate it, or to praise it when it occurs. As you know from your own lives, when given a little territory of your own, whether a room to live in, or an event to dress for, or a speech to make, or a ceremony to attend, your first thought is to look for the beautiful. Everybody has an instinct to decorate the room in which he lives according to his own taste, and also to compare that taste with others, to stand back from the painting that he's applied to the wall and ask himself whether it's right or wrong, whether it would look good in such and such circumstances, how the furniture should be put in place, and what would others think. And in particular, it's that question, what would others think, which makes people behave correctly in the aesthetic sphere. Nobody wants ostentatiously to give offence, or they didn't want ostentatiously to give offence until that became part of what it is to be a creative artist, which is what, of course, is taught in the art schools today. So in defiance of that natural instinct that we all have to beautify our lives, which is an instinct, as I say, that belongs to our natural politeness, our ability and desire to respect each other. In defiance of that, there has been what the novelist Milan Kundera calls the uglification of modern life. Wherever we turn, we find the deliberate desecration of beautiful things, the employment of shapes, forms, and gestures which are calculated to either to repel us or simply to annihilate the surrounding experience of beauty. I've just been speaking about the destiny of Washington under the impact of the postmodern architecture, which now is accumulating on the edge of the old center. These great big boxes of glass, often of mirror glass, which are not just characterless in themselves, but obliterate the whole sense of the city as a settlement, a shared settlement, a place where you would want to make your home, turning it from a settlement into a kind of transit camp where you appear in an office for a few hours of the day before escaping from the center. And this kind of architecture, which everybody now knows is growing everywhere, is obliterating our cities, but by turning them into places where we don't really want to be. We have to come there to work, but we don't want to remain there when the hours of work are over. And that's part of what uglification is, turning everything into an instrument of some purpose of the individual, in defiance of any sense of community or belonging. And I think people are beginning to rebel against the kind of architecture that's been imposed on our cities since the war, but it's rather late in the day to do so. You, of course, are lucky here in the Catholic University in that the efforts of many people have been devoted to making this into a beautiful environment, a place where you want to be, which you will regard as home, and the memory of which you will cherish in your lives hereafter. And if you look round at this room, you can see just how easy it is to do. It didn't require a great deal of thought or a great deal of discussion to recognize that you have to build a room with certain proportions, that you have to have details that people will like, and moldings around the edges and so on. And the result is, okay, not a great work of art, but everybody's going to be happy here for as long as it exists. But the uglification of modern life means that everywhere we look, there's a kind of brash, in-your-face culture displaying itself, the culture of the consumer society, which says, which invades everything and asks of every event and episode, what's in it for me? The me idea is written on the face of those glass boxes, and it's about the only thing written on the face of them. This clamour for attention as well of anything that presents itself as art. And if you complain about this, you will discover that you are actually part of the enemy. We belong, this consumer society is also a society which refuses judgment. Judgment is the original sin. Somebody who says, there is a right and wrong way to build, or a right and wrong way to dress, a right and wrong way to decorate, that there is beautiful language and ugly language, and so on. Such a person is condemned as the great spoil sport, the one who is judging others when he has no right to do so, because the whole realm of aesthetic experience is judgment-free. This uglified world accuses the one who wishes to criticize it, and it wishes to remove all obstacles to the gratification of the self. And we've seen this in all kinds of walks of life. No outsider to America can look on the recent dispute over the nomination to the Supreme Court without recognizing the extreme ugliness of the whole thing. It was as though America had decided overnight to put on display to the external world that this is the ugliest society in existence. Whichever side you took in the dispute, it was a side which required shouting and screaming, the deformation of the face, lying and manipulation, and also the undermining of anything that suggested that human beings could rise above this and decide the issue in a rational and calm way. So that uglification of the political process has occurred also. The uglification of cities, roads, landscape, and the rest. And a lot of it has to do, of course, with television and the internet, which have so trapped our attention that it's only the shocking and the disturbing that can give us any sense of saying something new. But of course what they're saying is the same as they've always been saying, namely that the world is not worth living in. So nothing else, only ugliness can capture our jaded attention. That seems to be the basic assumption behind the uglified society. And it goes also with what all Catholics will recognize as an important social phenomenon, which is the deconsecration of sacred things. And it's very obvious to Catholics, at least, that this has happened in the case of personal life, of birth and reproduction and death, the most important events in our lives. These have been deconsecrated. Marriage, of course, has been deconsecrated, handed over to the state, and then uglified by being made into a mere pursuit of me, of my gratification, rather than a devotion to you. And this deconsecration, therefore, has led also to a desecration of things. Nobody is happy with the result, including those who brought it about. their unhappiness is manifest in the ugliness of the thing that they've produced. So what is the antidote to this? Obviously, the antidote is beauty, and I don't think that we have lost the power to use that antidote and to reconsecrate our lives by means of it. What distinguishes beauty in all of human endeavors is that the beautiful object is not appreciated simply as a means to something else. It's not a tool, it's not an instrument for gaining advantage or anything like that. The beautiful object is something which is understood and appreciated for what it is, for its own sake. It has an intrinsic meaning and value. And we, in the situation in which we are now, in this uglified world, are looking for something which will redeem that world by enabling us to rise above the whole idea of instrumental values. To look on the world in such a way that it isn't simply being treated as an instrument for my own gratification, for enhancing my position, giving me power, pleasure, and all the other worldly values which cause people to annihilate their surroundings. So through beauty, through pursuit of beauty, we are trying to refashion human life so that peace and rest form the heart of it. And this, I think, connects the pursuit of beauty automatically with the two forms of life that have always been associated with it. First of all, art, and secondly, religion. Art means, the pursuit of art, the creation of art, means taking aesthetic choice and raising it into a realm of its own. So it becomes a way of life, a way of expressing the life in you, a way of praising and endorsing the world and affirming your own being and the being of others along with it. But at the same time subduing those appetites that cause you to obliterate the existence of others. Now, in everyday life, obviously, means and instrumentality dominate our ends and our purposes. But the judgment of beauty brings that domination to a limit. It conveys a sense of the end, a sense of the intrinsic value of certain things that we pursue. And in art, there is only intrinsic value. When you tell a story, writing a novel or a story or an epic in verse, for instance, such as the great epics of Helme, you do so not to convey information, but to give an example of something. You're creating an imaginary world which is interesting for its own sake, precisely because you, the creator, and the listener or reader don't inhabit that world. It's not a world which is possible for you to enter, so you can stand back from it, contemplate it, look for order in it, see exactly how things fit together, how they can be completed and fulfilled, so that they become interesting intrinsically for what they are. And in that way, a work of art, a work of fiction, can lift human life out of the whole struggle of instrumentality and appetite and present it as an object of contemplation for its own sake. And maybe that work of fiction, that epic or whatever it is full of tragedy and unpleasant things. But in presenting it in this presenting tragedy in this imaginary form, we enable people to stand back from it, to recognize its intrinsic connection with the rest of our lives, so that it's part of the order of the whole. The tragic work of art shows us that death and suffering are part of the human condition, and without them, all those good things that depend upon them wouldn't be available to us. So art in that way reconciles us to human life, gives us a sense that life has an intrinsic meaning and is as such justified in itself. And that is one great antidote to uglification, and it's the antidote which has informed my life. I'm a relatively sedentary person. At least I was until I met my fox hunting wife, and the result of which has been a series of interesting accidents. Nevertheless, it is second nature for me to sit around reading, listening to music, playing the piano, and so on. But in all of that, I flatter myself perhaps, but in all of that, I think I have found a way of looking on life as intrinsically meaningful, as making a place for me without me having to pursue in a clamorous way my own appetites. I can stand back and say, it is good to be, and that the things that are impinging on me and uglifying my existence can be resisted. I can turn away from them and make my own sphere where I can build life in another way. But of course, most people in this room, I'm sure, who will be of Catholic faith and will recognize that art is all very well, but it itself depends upon something deeper, upon the religious sentiment from which our desire to be at home in the world originally begins. And many religious people will say that without faith, you aren't ever really at home in the world. You sense your condition as one of alienation. You're looking for something, even if you don't yourself know this. Something that will reconcile your way of being not only to yourself and to others, but to the divine order that governs everything. But whatever you think about that, it is certainly true that religion, like art, is a realm of value. It's a realm in which we try to raise up the human condition into a light that shines from elsewhere, the light of the divine. We know, whether we're believers or not, we know that we cannot ourselves create the light which fully redeems our world. We look for it elsewhere. We can look for it in art, but for most people, most religious people, the real source of that light is the divine. And the search for beauty in earthly things takes us first to art, and through art to the ideal in which the divine is prefigured. And I think this is one of the most important features of religion that, at least for someone of my formation, namely that it attaches beauty to the world, brings down into the world the beauty that rescues it from this craven ugliness which is growing all around us. And religions, in particular the Christian religion, are founded in activities which are intrinsically beautiful in themselves, which create a fabric of meaning that is laid over the surface of the world in such a way that the world indeed becomes a home for us. Rituals do this. The Mass, of course, does this. The habit of prayer and the recognition of the sacred in things, the reconsecration of the world. And that, I think, is the point on which I'd like to leave you, that the answer to the uglification that is growing all around us, which is putting the whole world on sale to our selfish appetites, the answer to that is a gesture, however we arrive at it, of reconsecration. We must reconsecrate the world as a place where we can belong as complete beings, and belong to others and to the community around us and to the world as a whole, and expel this uglification from the middle of our lives. But I will leave that now to my fellow panelists to say what that means. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Roger. So next we'll hear from Dr. David Schindler, who I think needs no introduction, but to those of you who have perhaps come from elsewhere, Dr. Schindler teaches philosophy at the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family here at Catholic University. He is deeply rooted in the world of Hans Urs von Balthasar, and our encounter has been driven in part by an interest in bringing together the aesthetics of von Hildebrand and von Balthasar. So in any case, I'm very happy to have you with us, David, and so invite you forward.
Thank you, John Henry. It really is a a privilege to be able to participate in a conversation on beauty, which I think is one of the things that has drawn us all here, a sense of the problem that Sir Roger just presented, that an attention to desire for beauty is something that has been lacking in our culture. So I'm grateful to be a part of the conversation. It's a privilege. Hunters von Balthasar observed that truth and goodness are obviously important matters, and in every age we find people willing to defend those transcendental properties, as he calls them. But that's less often the case with beauty. I think it's not as obvious that beauty is a serious matter, something worth dying for, in fact. And therefore, defenders are much more rare. But Balthasar argues that without beauty, in fact, it may not seem as serious initially, but truth and goodness ultimately depend on them. And if we lose beauty, we ultimately lose truth and goodness. So it's a crucial task in every age to defend beauty, and for that we can be grateful to Dietrich von Hildebrand, of course, and Hunters von Balthasar, but more recently to Sir Roger for the work that he's done. He's no doubt one of the great defenders of beauty in our age in the Anglophone world. So we have a debt to him for that. One of the points that he insists on is that beauty is not simply an experience, but a revelation of meaning, especially in the realm of art. And that the meaning that it reveals, as we saw in the presentation that he gave, bears on the meaning of everything and not just particular objects of art. So I thought the most fruitful way for me to participate in the discussion would be to raise two questions, and these are questions that were prompted by Sir Roger's book, A Very Short Introduction to Beauty, a wonderful presentation of his aesthetics. And the first question is really a request for elaboration. So one of the most illuminating things that I found in Sir Roger's book is a fascinating distinction between imagination and fantasy. Imagination and fantasy, we often think of those together, and I would like to request maybe an elaboration of that distinction in our discussion and the significance, because I think it might be illuminating for other people as well. In particular, what I find interesting is, as Sir Roger explains, the fantasy world seems to have a strange sort of mixture of the real and the unreal. It sort of blurs the lines, whereas as we heard in the presentation that he gave, the world of imagination is a world that's distinct from the world that we live in, and it's very clearly distinct. The world of fantasy seems somehow to blur the line between the real and the unreal, or the interested and disinterested. And the strange thing is that seems to give rise to a paradox, and this is alluded to in Sir Roger's book. But it would be helpful to hear perhaps an explanation. He points out in the book that imagination, in spite of the fact that it's an elevation out, a lifting in a certain sense beyond this world, in a certain respect allows us to enter more deeply into reality. So if it doesn't itself foster the connection between the soul and the real, it opens up that possibility in a profound way. And I think he made some very interesting comments already in his presentation there, but he points out the contrast in fantasy. There's a certain inner dynamic and inner logic that drives the experience of the fantasy world to addiction. It takes the form of addiction, which really is an isolation from reality. So strangely, the thing that elevates us beyond reality, helps us to enter in, whereas the one that's sort of a mix between the real and the unreal takes us out of reality. It would be helpful perhaps to hear a comment on that, especially in our age that is increasingly dominated by, I think, fantasy as opposed to imagination, virtual reality, and even oddly, it seems the increasing preoccupation with politics in the realm of art. You can't go to a concert now without a political message being spoken, and you wonder why. What's there? Is there somehow a misunderstanding of what art is? Precisely in the aim to make it meaningful. The second question that I wanted to ask is a little more of a critical question, I suppose. But I was struck at the end of Sir Roger's book on beauty. He said in his concluding remarks that implicitly in the book he had rejected the Neoplatonic and scholastic notion of beauty as a transcendental property, as a reflection of being. And he said the book implicitly rejects that. I would like to know why exactly, and what would be important, what would be gained by leaving that tradition. Early on in the book, Sir Roger had offered an explanation of the ways in which beauty seems to be in tension with truth and goodness, and perhaps that might remove it from that category. But many objections to those arguments occurred to me, which I won't elaborate here. But it seems to me that there must be more to it. Now, why is that important? It seems to me that there's a great deal at stake in the question of whether beauty is a transcendental property, in the sense of being a manifestation of being, having its roots in being. Why is that? On the one hand, it seems to me that without a sense of the transcendental depths, you might say, of beauty, it would be very difficult to sustain many of the things that Sir Roger argues for very, very centrally in his work. An important sense that beauty is a revelation of meaning. That it's a communication. He speaks in another book of things, the soul of things, things having something like a face, that their beauty is somehow a revelation of a kind of an internal depth. And it seems to me that saying something like that is only possible if one understands beauty as a transcendental property. The danger would be to deny that. One would, I think, eventually fall back into beauty as principally a subjective experience. And in the end, if beauty is a transcendental property, we can think of God's beauty as a communication of His reality. So the beauty of the world would be a communication of God's reality. If we deny the transcendental status of beauty, it seems to me that it becomes very difficult in the end to make an ultimate distinction between religious practices that evoke a sort of sense of the sacred, and really good art, which does the same thing. And it seems to me that that's if we have difficulty distinguishing between those, that raises a question about our understanding of beauty. So those are my two questions, about fantasy and about transcendental character of beauty. Thank you for your attention.
So this is just what we want, the accumulation of thoughts and questions, and I assume that is happening in all of your minds as well. But what we'll do is we'll finish our presentations, and then we'll go back to the questions, and I've noted your very good questions, David. So finally, we will hear from Dr. John Crosby, who, as I mentioned before, was a student of Dietrich von Hildebrand in the 1960s and to the end of von Hildebrand's life in 1977. Dr. Crosby was also a kind of student of John Paul II through his participation at the John Paul II Institute in Rome in the early days before the Holy Father's health became an obstacle to his time with people. So there was a great deal of learning that happened there. The whole encounter with Christian personalism was deepened there. And finally, among many publications, the thing to note here is that Dr. Crosby is one of the primary translators of the Hildebrand aesthetics that will be forthcoming. So let me welcome Dr. Crosby to the podium.
With all the talk about Dr. Crosby, it may not be evident to you that I'm the father of John Henry. Many, many thanks to Roger Scruton for not only his lecture today, but for his lifetime of defense of beauty against its many detractors. Now, my task is, I'm a senior fellow in the Hildebrand Project, is to build some bridges between Roger Scruton's work in aesthetics and that of Dietrich von Hildebrand. And I lay out or propose these bridges, eager to hear whether Roger Scruton recognizes these as indeed important points of contact between himself and von Hildebrand. Now, in his aesthetics, von Hildebrand has a great deal to say about the way in which beauty nourishes the human spirit. He's always insisting, and it seems to me this is exactly in the vein of Roger Scruton, always insisting that the aesthetic experience is not simply a matter of being entertained. This experience goes much deeper and touches the sources of our real flourishing and our real happiness. He argues that the experience of beauty is not a luxury, but a necessity. And it follows that a life deprived of beauty is an impoverished life. This means that a world full of ugliness, a world in which beauty is often replaced by kitsch, is a world which oppresses and demeans and deforms the human spirit. Now, this leads me to the Hildebrandian contribution I would like to make to the discussion with Roger Scruton. I want to identify certain deprivations of the human spirit discussed by von Hildebrand and explain why von Hildebrand sees beauty as the antidote to these deprivations. In this way, he helps us understand quite concretely how it is that we are made for beauty and can't survive spiritually in a world that lacks it. So there are three deprivations, three antidotes coming from beauty. Here's the first. In his aesthetics, von Hildebrand speaks about the prosaic, by which he means not just the everyday, like washing your hands, driving to work, but rather a certain aesthetic disvalue. He says, and I quote, "The quality of the prosaic emerges most clearly in certain human beings. The bureaucrat is specifically prosaic. The prosaic is the mechanization of the spirit, a mere soulless adhering to the shell of something. The Philistine is even more prosaic than the bureaucrat. This person thinks that things are real only in the sense of an austere usefulness. He regards everything else as a romantic trifle, an illusion, a waste of time. Such persons emanate a prosaic, oppressive dull atmosphere. End of that quote. In the next sentence, von Hildebrand brings home to us academics the concept of the prosaic. He says, the prosaic exists analogously in the world of the university. There is a specifically professorial dullness, a distressing pedantry, which constitutes a specific antithesis to true personal culture. End of that quote. So if you don't get the idea of the prosaic at first, you'll surely get it now when it's presented in its professorial form. Now, von Hildebrand wants to say that the prosaic constitutes a specific antithesis to beauty. The dullness of the prosaic is antithetical to the radiance of beauty. The prose of the prosaic is antithetical to the song of beauty. Von Hildebrand says that all beauty sings. There's perhaps no better way to characterize prosaic people than to say that they don't sing. They are devoid of the spirit of song. Now, what I most of all want to point out is that the prosaic type is an impoverished human being. And that by contrast, the type who sings in the presence of beauty has a full, abundant humanity. The professorial dullness and the distressing pedantry of certain intellectuals gives evidence of a withered existence as persons, whereas those who are deeply affected by beauty sing and give evidence of an awakened existence as persons. It follows that if a person wants to recover from his or her prosaic dullness, that person has to stop thinking of beauty as a romantic trifle and to start taking it seriously, letting its spirit of song affect him deeply. Beauty is then one main antidote to that flattening out of a person that von Hildebrand deplores in the bureaucrat and in other prosaic types. There's a second personal deformation for which von Hildebrand sees beauty as the antidote. In his Aesthetics, he writes extensively about what he calls the mediocrity of certain persons. By mediocre, he does not mean average, undistinguished, getting a grade of C. He rather has in mind a certain personal disvalue, a disvalue that forms a specific antithesis to beauty. He sees it embodied in the Philistine and the bourgeois. It's akin to the prosaic, but not exactly the same. Here is how he characterizes the mediocrity that concerns him in aesthetics. And I quote, "The Philistine hates everything that is unconditional. He never wants to leave his warm nest or lose the solid ground under his feet. In keeping with this basic attitude, he regards all that is unconditional and heroic, all glowing enthusiasm, and the total gift of oneself as exaggerated. He does not wish to utter a Promethean protest against the world of values and ultimately against God, or to commit himself genuinely to them. He is not driven hither and thither by evil passions. He wants to remain on the golden middle ground in every sphere of life. He never wants to relinquish possession of himself to anything. He does not want to be swept off his feet by great passions or to be touched in the innermost depths by lofty goods which are greater than himself." End of that quote. Von Hildebrand proceeds to identify the opposite of this Philistine mediocrity. He speaks of a certain freedom of spirit, of a breadth of mind and heart, a capacity for that elevated existence that Plato called divine madness. But what most concerns us here is the antithesis between mediocrity and beauty. Again and again in his aesthetic writings, von Hildebrand quotes the significant saying of Ernst de Laux, a French writer of the early 20th century, that, quote, "There is nothing the mediocre person hates as much as beauty." End of that quote. What is meant is that beauty, when it seizes us, draws us into a kind of divine madness, and this disrupts that security and control in which the mediocre person wants to ensconce himself. The mediocre person does not want to be beside himself, does not want to live ecstatically outside of himself, and so resents the call of beauty and sees it as something excessive and overwrought. Now, the point at which I'm driving is this. A mediocre person, as characterized by von Hildebrand, is a person with a greatly diminished humanity. And a person fascinated by beauty is a fully alive person. Beauty has the power to dislodge us from that small frame of reference in which we feel safe, and to elicit from us the exuberance of a more abundant life. And if you wonder what I mean by exuberance, just recall the spirit of song that von Hildebrand sees inhering in beauty. So, beauty is the antidote to the prosaic deformation of a person, and also the antidote to a mediocre deformation of a person. And of the many other such deformations surveyed by von Hildebrand, I pick out one more. That's my third and last. He discusses the disorder that a person obsessed with productivity suffers. There are people, plenty of them at the university, myself on many days included, who are consumed with their many projects, eaten up by them. They never come to rest, but are always driven to complete a project, to start another one. They feel that their existence is justified only if they are getting results and becoming ever more productive. Such people run the risk of turning themselves into instruments for production, and in this way depersonalizing themselves. Now, how does beauty, according to von Hildebrand, heal persons who have lost themselves in their projects? In this way, beauty demands to be received, so he argues, in a contemplative attitude. The beautiful thing is lifted out of all pragmatic use and admired for its own sake. Sir Roger spoke of that in talking about the intrinsic value of beauty. The beautiful thing can show itself as beautiful only after you have silenced all your projects, all your use of instrumental reason, only after you have learned to dwell contemplatively with the beautiful thing. In this aesthetic contemplation, you come to yourself as person. You're no longer just one who exists for the sake of getting results, but somehow for your own sake. Von Hildebrand writes in his Aesthetics, the specifically contemplative element in the frui. Frui is the opposite of uti, meaning to use, frui meaning to take delight in. The specifically contemplative element in the frui of genuine beauty in nature and art has an eminent significance for the entire personality. Few things depersonalize a human being as much as the complete absorption in practical tasks. It is only when contemplation and contemplative acts receive their due in our lives that we can truly be persons. It is only then that we come to our true self. End of that quote. And I conclude laying this all in front of Sir Roger, eager for his reaction. I think there's a fundamental kinship with von Hildebrand, but I'll let him determine that. And I conclude like this, that the loss of beauty in the contemporary world is not just a cultural loss, but an individual existential loss. It cripples persons. And beauty, for its part, is not just a cultural good, but an individual, existential good. It has the power to regenerate persons. Thank you.
Well, I had originally thought that we would go to questions from the audience, but I think that our panelists have put some very important reflections on the table. So, Sir Roger, perhaps we could first hear from you, and then we will, if all of this resolves nicely, then we'll go to I promise you we will go to questions from you as well. So would you like to, you can just do, we'll do this next part from our seats.
Okay. Well, David Schindler raised 2 points. First, really asking me to elaborate a bit on the distinction between fantasy and imagination. And secondly, declaring that, for him at least, beauty is a transcendental, like truth, goodness, and being, and that if we don't admit it to be so, a crucial aspect of beauty, namely that it's a way of rooting ourselves in being, is lost to us, something like that, yeah. I would say about fantasy and imagination, this is a distinction which has been made in different ways down the centuries. It was made first in an articulate way by Coleridge, the poet, who may be known to everybody as the poet of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and Christabel and so on, who distinguished fancy from imagination. And he said things which I wanted to reshape for the use of modern people. And fantasy for me involves the creation or reception of fantasy objects whose appeal consists in the fact that they're indistinguishable from reality, or at least give you an alternative reality, and as a result awaken real feelings and give them, if you like, an artificial satisfaction. Whereas imagination involves the invocation of an entire world, a world which is other than this one, which you know to be other than this one, which you're not tempted to enter because you know you can't. And therefore you can exercise your emotions freely in that world, as we do in the theatre or when reading a novel or an epic poem. And as a result, imagination leads to the education of the emotions. Whereas fantasy, precisely because it's sort of it aims at a kind of substitute reality, it bleeds into the actual world and traps us there. The obvious example is pornography, of course, as compared with genuine erotic art, such as the Venuses of Titian. And pornography, as people now know it, is something which intrudes into their world, arouses all kinds of substitute emotions and feelings which nevertheless demand satisfaction. And as you know, and you made this point, it becomes addictive. And addiction is, as you again rightly said, is a way of taking you out of this world, taking you away from it, whereas you never get addicted to imaginative things. An imagined world requires an effort on your part to enter it and to understand it and to see what it would be for how it could translate into real experiences of your own. You learn from imagination, you become enslaved to fantasy. And if thinking about these things is very difficult, I know, but there are people, I'm sure, in this audience who've had to think about them in the course of therapeutic activities and so on, and to recognize that for instance, sexual fantasy is a door into a nightmare world, whereas the erotic art of Titian or Shakespeare or Keats is a door into something beautiful where you can roam freely without being tempted. So that, I think, is a very important distinction. The reason why I think beauty is not a transcendental has something to do with the fact that I don't believe that there are transcendentals. But it is also that I have such a vivid experience of ugliness. The ugly things that surround us and intrude on our lives, for me, they're really real. But in other words, the absence of beauty can exist with something which nevertheless is replete with being. And it oughtn't to, if beauty was a transcendental, it ought to belong to everything, even to those horrible blocks that dominate the center of Detroit, for instance. If beauty is a transcendental, then Detroit is saved, but it clearly isn't. But I agree with Dr. Crosby, with John Crosby, about that there is much in common between Hildebrand's sense of what's at stake in the pursuit of beauty with what I said, as you rightly said, the sense of beauty as the thing that heals these diseases of the soul is really important for me. And the diseases you mentioned, the prosaicization of the world, and the kind of bureaucratic depersonalization, etc., the instrumentalization of things. These are all things which I think we're all aware of, quite difficult to say exactly what they are, and Hildebrand deserves some credit for having tried to say what they are. Many poets have also endorsed this message, and I would say that this doesn't really differ from things that I would say in another tone of voice. The great problem, I think, for everybody is one that was pointed out by Kant, namely that while we all love beauty and want it, we are not all artistically inclined, he himself being one of them. There are unmusical people in this room for whom music doesn't mean anything. Yet for a musical person, music contains the secret of life. It's the thing that will give us that sense of wholeness that we're all looking for. But if we tie beauty too closely to artistic activity, we, as it were, remove it from humanity as a whole. We make it into an elite possession, and it shouldn't be that, if it is going to be the real healing force. But it's one reason for thinking that perhaps beauty, or art rather, it has to give way to religion in the end if we're looking for something that will heal everyone. So anyway, that's my thought.
David, would you like to pursue a little bit the...
No, I think we can
open. Okay, we can do that.
Thank you. Sir Roger and the panel, I have a question about the intersection of a number of concepts. The first is with regard to Christian personalism as it relates to socialism, capitalism. What are your thoughts on how it is that we can, on the one hand, encourage individualism and the experience of beauty, and at the same time go down the path, as you were describing, Sir Roger, consumerism. At the same time, we have our current Pope, who seems to be, if not indifferent, not fully supportive of capitalism in the way that our previous two popes were. So be curious to hear your thoughts about the intersection of those concepts. Thank you.
Well, this is a more political question, obviously. Let's go back to what I think personalism is. I'm not speaking as a Catholic. I'm an Anglican. which is a nondescript kind of thing to be. But I do believe that the concept of the human person is fundamental to understanding not just what we are as individuals, but our relations to others. We see other people as persons. That means recognizing that they are free and accountable, just as we are. And there's some people don't try and live through their lives not recognizing the freedom of others, seeing others simply as instruments to be used. And that is one of the great sins. That is the beginning of evil, when you instrumentalize even the human being. And it's what we lived through in the 20th century, and we haven't finished living through it as well. But it's also the case that there are things which are not human beings, which are persons. For instance, governments, nations. You here are quite lucky in America that you have a government which is a kind of corporate person. That's to say, it takes responsibility for what it does, it acts freely, it can be accused of its faults and held to account for them. And the same is true of corporate persons, businesses and so on. And when people complain about capitalism, that it depersonalizes everything, they have a point, but they tend to forget this other thing, the way in which it also personalizes everything by making our corporate activities into things for which we are accountable. There is no solution, no political solution, to my mind, to the problems that we have all been three have been talking about, the uglification of the world. You're not going to get a political solution to that. You can get a cultural solution, perhaps, when everybody grows up to knowing what is at stake. But whether socialism or capitalism is more compatible with the personalist vision is not something which is very easy to determine. All I know, however, is that personalism became a real force in Central Europe when it was first growing in the philosophy of Schindler and Hildebrand and Wojtyła and so on. It became a real force as a center of opposition to totalitarianism, Nazism on the one hand and communism on the other, and it is a seriously anti-socialist position, but not necessarily a pro-capitalist one.
Thank you so much. I teach at a high school down in Lynchburg, Virginia. It's a real pleasure to be here, sir. I had a question for Sir Roger Scruton. I teach literature to 10th graders, and I teach them Homer and Dante, among other things. I try to convince them that there is a difference between good books and bad books. And one of the ways I did that is I said, Dante is better than USA Today. We can all agree on this. But I got myself in trouble when I'd said that we can make the judgments in other areas as well. I told them that Bach was better than Lady Gaga, objectively so. I got in trouble there, where all of my students seemed to be already indoctrinated in this idea that to make judgments concerning beauty is a sign that one is a bigot. And I even had meetings with parents afterwards. There were a lot of people very upset about this.
Yeah.
How could I best go about persuading my audience that this is so?
It's a very interesting question. And I think one has to start very tentatively when it comes to this music thing. Trying to get your students to judge between different works of different pop songs. Get them to see that in Poker Face, Lady Gaga is singing on one note only, and they will recognize, whoa, isn't something missing here? That thing called melody, and then compare it with, say, Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel, where you've got a melody. And it will give them the sense, yes, there is a difference between these two things, and there might be a reason for preferring one to the other, and gradually work up to the point where they can accept judgment, at least about the world in which they are, and point out to them the connection between repetitiveness and addiction. That you're becoming enslaved to this music because it's simply giving you those 3 wretched chords over this 4 and a 4 and a bar, and so that you can't emancipate yourself from that rhythm. And here is something, try Spiral Architects is a metal group which has pieces with 25.5 beats in a bar or something like that. This at least is different. You're not going to get addicted to this. In fact, you want to turn it off, don't you? And I think if you do that enough, young people do recognize that judgment is actually part of what's already going on in them. It's just that they're killing it by becoming addicted to certain easygoing ways of listening. It won't get them to Bach. Just like that. Because to get to Bach, you've got to go through that territory which really frightens them, which is silence. That means turning that thing off for 12 hours and then listening.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger. So you spoke about beauty and the beautiful as that which pleases and sort of draws us forth and draws us into community, and the ugly as repellent and what displeases. But then you also spoke about the uglification of modern life, which suggests that there are a lot of people who are choosing the ugly, either choosing to construct it or choosing to pursue it or choosing to be attracted to it. And so I'm wondering how you account for that. Is there some compelling power in the ugly, or what is it that makes a person choose the ugly when beauty is on offer?
Yeah, it's a very good question.
Not the transcendentality of...
The fact, of course, the need for beauty is rooted in the human soul. That's undeniably true. But there are shortcuts, that people take. And David already mentioned this by referring to addiction that comes through fantasy. Those shortcuts gratify without satisfying. They're the things which produce the instant pleasure. You press the button, but then the pleasure's gone. So you have to press the button again. You press it again and again until finally you're enslaved. And the condition of enslavement is a paradigm ugliness. That's how human beings make themselves ugly. So it was, as it were, ugliness arises in that way by an invisible hand from the intentions of ordinary people to gratify themselves immediately. And I think that's the general, beauty requires a long-term view, and that the long-term view is painful to acquire.
Okay, is it on? Yes. Thanks to all 3 of the panelists for your talks. Really appreciate it. I just wanted to pick up on something right at the end. So Roger Scruton, you said that, not everyone has, I'm going to stand up, not everyone has sort of an artistic soul or access to the artistic. We can't all appreciate music or even make it, right? But if beauty, it really is so important to human being, then it seems to me that there has to be some way that it's not just we're spectators to it, or only the few can create and then everyone else has to be spectator. And I was wondering, and this is partially based on the fact that you brought up John Paul II, if we could say, and how we could say, that our work itself has to be beautiful. Not just that the what we make should be beautiful all the time, and that would be great, but that work itself, like the act of working, should be beautiful, and therefore all of humanity could be brought into sort of this act of making the beautiful, so to speak. And I would ask all 3 of you to respond to that. Thank you.
Well, I'll begin then. Yes, I think this is this is a very important thing that unites Christianity and Islam, the view that there is a beautification of everyday life, performing what you have to do, which might be sweeping a room, or sweeping the street, but doing it beautifully, doing it, in other words, in such a way that as to recognize others and recognize that how it looks to others, want to make it look to others as though this was part of their life too. And I think that that beautification is a most important part of the human condition, and it's what is taught, of course, paradigmatically by Islam. And Christians used to teach this too. I mean, it was part of the old Puritan message of the settlers of Massachusetts, from whom all of you lot are in tremendous rebellion, of course, but that your daily life is an offering to God, and it is so because it is made beautiful by what you do. I think that's a very good suggestion. But I think there's another thing to be said, though. When ordinary people down the centuries people uninfluenced by mass communication and all the consumer society and all the things that we know, when they have let themselves express themselves in artistic forms through their ordinary building, for instance, the ordinary building of villages, or through folk songs, never do they produce ugliness. The little villages scattered all over Europe are all of them without exception beautiful. And the folk music of Europe has no ugly examples in it. And when people started discovering folk music, when the new ways of producing music came in and obliterated the folk music, composers hurried to write down these treasures, which were the products of ordinary people, ordinary unassuming people doing what they wanted to do. And I think this is a very important thing, that maybe the mass of people have lost the ability to make beautiful things, not because they can't, but because this new great uglifying machine that was referred to by the gentleman over there, that has mutilated the ears of his students, has come between them and their natural instincts.
David, would you like to say something?
Just maybe add a quick note that another, I suppose it's part of the uglification machine, is the economic system that drives work typically, that almost requires a kind of instrumentalizing, which is precisely a kind of uglification. And there's certainly a connection between that and this historical drift of the sense of beauty to a purely subjective experience. It becomes increasingly a matter of a private experience, and therefore not a matter of something that belongs in the world. And so we think of work as something that we do because we have to, in order to acquire the means then to enjoy beauty now in the form of entertainment and something that's enjoyed in the home. The response to that would require such a radical rethinking of how society is organized, so that we don't instrumentalize the things that we make, but treat them. Schiller's got Friedrich Schiller, the German philosopher, is I think one of the best philosophers of beauty. As a matter of fact, speaks of giving things dignity. When you make something, or even clothes that one wears, you give those the things themselves a certain dignity. What does that mean? It means that they're not simply functional, but have a certain. You treat them as in a certain sense as if they're granting you use. There's obviously metaphor there and analogy, but there's something to that. That I think makes a lot of sense in terms of work, building a chair that has a certain dignity, as opposed to simply fulfilling a function or meeting a bottom line or that sort of thing.
A few more questions. It's very hard for me to choose from here without feeling like I'm being selective.
There's an urgent lady over there.
Okay, let's the urgent lady over there. Okay.
Thank you very much for your talk, Sir Scruton. I really enjoyed it. My question is about, I've heard this saying that you can't develop a sense of beauty, you can't develop your intellect unless all the needs of your body are taken care of, and that you can't, you need to develop the body first, or nurture the body before you can nurture the soul, more or less. And so my question was, considering that intellect or beauty and a highly developed sense of beauty is for everyone, how do you give that to people, underserved populations who generally do not have their bodily needs taken care of?
Right. It's a difficult question, this. Obviously, if you're in a state of physical need, let's say you're ill, hungry, in pain, and so on, it's rather difficult then to turn your attention to the beautiful. The beautiful seems to belong to the realm of redundancy. When all the jobs are done and we can take a leisurely attitude to things, then the beauty of the world dawns on us. It's only a saint who can find beauty when in a state of pain or sickness or whatever. Interestingly enough, though, we have a whole tradition of people who did just that. St. John of the Cross and similar meditative poets of the early ages were people who were familiar with starvation and deprivation and sleeplessness and so on, and often cultivated it in order to have that vision of beauty which came suddenly in the early hours. And that's not just a Christian tradition. Rumi and Hafiz and the Persian poets likewise did this. So we don't really, there's no clear connection between being sated and being able to enjoy beauty. But for us, for weak people like us in this room, that's the easiest way to go about it. But when it comes to impoverished people in the world today, impoverished communities in Latin America or elsewhere, it should be remembered that an impoverished community might still not be living in a state of physical need, of actual hunger or sickness or pain. They just don't have the access to all the pleasures and luxuries and comforts that we have. But when we remember that those pleasures and luxuries and comforts have led to the uglification of our world, we are apt to think that maybe they're going to get a better deal when it comes to beauty than we have. Look at their dancing and their singing, for instance. It's rather more cheerful and pure than ours. So that's one answer anyway.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My question is regarding dialectics, and I wonder how you can avoid them. What I specifically mean is a lot of our learning is learned through what we perceive to be differences, East, West.
Yeah.
And if not dialectics, then we also understand things through a hierarchy. For an example, a car can be more beautiful, but doesn't make it less a car. So you have a hierarchy of goods. How do we avoid that? And Dr. Schindler, I agree with you. It seems to me that we would have a problem if we don't admit of transcendentals. And would you say that truth is not a transcendental, the good is not a transcendental, or is it just beauty that's not a transcendental? And my last comment about the prosaic person or the mediocre person. What if that person is a contemplative person and is less active on the realm of our perception of that being? Does that person truly someone who is less full?
Very efficient question asking here. So we'll...
Yeah, there's a lot of questions there, and it's all very interesting. Obviously, we are questioning beings, and we do automatically contrast the thing that we're interested in with some alternative. When you begin to be interested in music, for instance, or painting, you're never satisfied simply to be exploring the Western tradition or whatever it might be. You're bound to get interested in, what did they do elsewhere? What is Indian and Balinese music really like? And that's the way that actually our aesthetic sensibilities expand, by coming to identify in imagination with people to whom we don't spontaneously belong, but we come to see that of course their world is in its own way as interesting as ours. So I think that the dialectical process is very important for expanding your cultural expertise or cultural acquisitions, really. Now, the other point, I can't remember now. I mentioned
something about the hierarchy.
Yeah, hierarchies. Yes, we do rank things. This was the worry that the gentleman to your left had. How we rank things by judging them. What is better than other things, and so on. It isn't. It isn't vital to have a precise hierarchy in your mind of all the things that you like, and often you're content simply to have a repertoire that you can draw upon, things that are appropriate for this situation or that situation, rather than having a hierarchy of values, even though you make judgments of one kind or another. So I think that's all very... we're now getting into the whole business of what criticism is and whether it can be taught or not. People who teach literature or teach art or music confront this question. Can you teach these things without also teaching some kind of a critical response to them? If someone who says that that Van Gogh and Thomas Kinkade, they're the same kind of thing, what are you going to say to him? Are you going to give him a long discourse on the nature of kitsch and hope that he'll learn from it, or do you just show the thing? This is the big question that all critics have to confront. I think that's...
Yes. Do you want to say something, David, or? No. All right.
No, I would, though, like if I could return to an earlier question and give it a little more attention. I thought it was very probing, the question about the ugly and why the fascination with the ugly when beauty is available. And one can give one answer in terms of a certain cheap, seductive appeal of what's ugly, but perhaps a deeper account of the appeal of the ugly is that it's a way of striking a blow at the beautiful. Mm. So there is an understandable antagonism to the beautiful with its mystery of transcendence. And one way to strike out against that and live out one's resentment is to, as it were, emphatically produce the ugly and yes. Revel in that. You in your book mention an astonishing case of a desecration of a Mozart opera, where yes. in place of the lovers you have prostitutes performing obscene actions on the stage, where the conductor wanted to desecrate the beautiful piece of work. And so that I'd like to hear more from you about that motive, where we're drawn not just to the ugly because we have a weakness for kitsch, but drawn to the ugly as part of a protest against the beautiful.
There was in Japan this beautiful temple at Kyoto, the most beautiful building in all Japan, and one day it burnt down, and they discovered that it had been burnt down by one of the monks, and he was asked, why did you do this? He said, because it was so beautiful, it made me feel really inferior. I couldn't live with it. And there is, at least that's honest. You're absolutely right. There is a desire to desecrate, which is as old as mankind. Iconoclasm is all about this. The history of the church through the first 10 centuries has involved constant sweeping of the iconoclasm across the continent of Europe. And we in England tragically lost 98% of our art in the 17th century when the Puritans just went rampage through the churches, smashing things, pretending this was idolatry. But of course, they smashed them because they were, in comparison with those things, what they were and believed and were doing was so ugly. So we do have a desire to desecrate, and we have the desire to desecrate the human form, which is what pornography is all about. And to desecrate the human being, to reduce him to a state of objecthood. And that's what the concentration camps were all about. That's why Europe went through that terrible episode, because the people who conducted it were just those sort of people who were made to feel inferior by the perception around them of ideals to which they couldn't match, to which they couldn't live up. And unfortunately had the power, nevertheless, to bring those things down.
So I think we will have to take just one more question, which is very, very sad.
Urgent lady over there.
Urgent lady over there. All right, Catherine, can you bring can the urgent lady stand? So Catherine can...
Hi, my name is Red. I go here. Thank you for answering all our questions. I just have one more question. But what if it being ugly becomes mainstream? And I study fashion marketing, and when you brought up consumerism, I thought that was really interesting, because there's this new wave of loving ugly things. And before it used to be a protest to beauty, but now I feel like it's become superficial, it's lost its power. So what happens when ugly is mainstream and everyone loves ugly? And does that mean that beauty changes throughout time?
Right. It's a very deep question, and it is connected with what I was talking about, the uglification of things around us. The first response is to say, can people really love things because they're ugly? Aren't they really deceiving themselves into thinking that in some way this uglification is a beautification? If you look at the truly ugly things that you encounter in modern art museums now, they will always be presented not as a manifestation of ugliness, but as a challenge to accepted values. They are the expression of this critical spirit, which is raising questions about the complacent bourgeois world in which we live. And that very few people would say, I do it because it's ugly. And if they did, they would have to accept the rebuke. In that case, you shouldn't expect me to admire this. And fashions which involve self-conscious use of ugly details, like mutilation of the body or whatever, those fashions, they are a perversion. I think we should allow ourselves to think that this is a perversion of something natural, and it will not survive. Or if it did survive, it's because human nature has changed. But you will see, down the centuries, all kinds of difficult cases. Certain African ways of decorating the face by distorting the mouth with rings or pushing the neck up with metal rings and so on. We now look on that and think, that's hideous. But put it in its context and you'll see that actually people didn't do this because they thought it was hideous. This was a way of beautifying by showing the human body as somehow plastic, in a way of expressing an idea. So there are so few examples of people mutilating themselves in order to make themselves ugly. But that's not a perfect example, answer to your question at all.
Well, I don't know, if the answer is in one of your books, then they could find it there, but it might mean that you have another book to write. And I think all of you know already that Sir Roger has a prolific presence online in the form of videos and talks and interviews, and so those of you who don't know that, you can learn more about what was discussed today and so much more. And I also want to, in closing, just say that the Catholic University Bookstore has, I think, particularly in light of this event, a number of Roger's books on questions of beauty and culture and conservatism, so I invite you there. And of course, for the Hildebrand Aesthetics, which will be forthcoming in November, that can be, you can become aware of that launch if you're not already on our email list or on our social media by following us there, and that will come very soon. And I want to thank once more Dr. McCarthy of Catholic University's School of Philosophy. Thank you very much for having us here, and we look forward to being back. And we have a reception for you, so we hope that you'll stay. It's over on this stage left, and we hope you'll stay. And this is also your chance, I suppose, to ask Sir Roger a question. We have to take him away, unfortunately, in the near future. In any case, thank you, Dr. Crosby, Dr. Schindler, and Sir Roger. Thank you all for coming.